First off, I want to welcome everyone to St. Mark's webinar. And tonight I am excited to have James Hollier, our much beloved Director of Music and Liturgy here at St. Mark's. James tells me that he grew up in South Carolina and Arkansas and developed a love for music in college, which is quite remarkable that you got into organ and all sorts of other instruments during that period of time, which just goes to show you how talented you are. He attended Sewanee, where he received a bachelor's degree in music and English, and then attended SMU, receiving a master's in sacred music. I know there's a story behind that, and I would love to hear it sometime. James, St. Mark's is blessed to have you, and truly I can say, having worked with several other directors of music in my own working history, you are probably the best one I have ever worked with. So I am truly honored to have you. This evening, James is going to be discussing music in times of trial. We'll be looking at pieces and hymns developed during the Protestant Reformation, the Black Plague, that I want to hear about, World War I, World War II, as well as some other times. But before we begin, let us pray. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Heavenly Father, we are so blessed that we have music to express our hearts and our minds. And Lord, we thank you for the power that it has to move us, the power that it has to move us in worship, the power it has to move us in our lives. We ask your blessings upon this time, and we pray that we will have our minds open and that we will truly learn some incredible things. We ask this in your most precious name. Amen. All righty. Well, all right, James, music has always reflected the times, right? It's especially the times in which it's created sort of reflects it, but sometimes it moves. It has power, you know.
Right.
And it power to move the masses. So I was wondering if you would begin by really talking about this power that it has and the influence that music has over us.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Music can be used and enjoyed for lots of different reasons, or not enjoyed, as the case may be. But yeah, so music, I typically see it as two different ways. It evokes or can be a response to an emotion, good or bad. Celebratory music versus sad music. Just the composers, just true expressions of how they're feeling when they write the music. And then there's also, and music can be both ways. There's also music that tries specifically to influence. And later on in the talk, I'll talk about, especially at wartime, you can think of sort of popular songs that were supposed to stir everybody up and get them ready to go off to battle, that sort of thing. And there's music that can do both at the same time. And so it's important to keep both those things in mind as we're going along, because each topic we go along on, or each topic we switch to, will address both of those at the same time. And it's really interesting that if you think about just sort of what we use music for now, both of those things are very much a part of it. It's been fun kind of to work on this and sort of Google through things. It's amazing how many articles there are right now on music during times of pandemic. I mean, there's a lot.
Wow.
A pandemic of it. So this one article that came up was talking about using music to help yourself through the pandemic, and it was talking about music you could listen to reduce stress, music you could listen to think more peaceful thoughts, music you could use to get to better sleep at night, because so many people aren't sleeping very well through all this. And so it's just interesting. I'm sure a lot of the composers of the music they were suggesting had none of those intents in mind, but people can use music for all different things. So yes, music can have the composer's intent in it, an artistic response to an emotion or feeling or an event, and it can also be used on the flip side to influence emotions. And with that, I would like to move into what for us Christians is probably our most sort of original and important music. Jerry Linus, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. I've been here about 10 minutes, but I just figured out how to turn the thing on.
Well, we saw a Jerry and we thought it was Jerry Potts. So glad it's you. Glad you're here. We just got started.
Yeah, I've been here. I just couldn't talk.
Okay, great.
Maybe that's not a bad thing.
So for us as Christians, probably the sort of our original music are the Psalms. Some people call the Psalms the hymnal of the Bible. They are a book of the Bible, but they were all intended to be sung. They were the first sort of liturgical music that was written that we know of. And the Psalms are probably my favorite book of the Bible. I just love them because they express the full gamut of emotion, from joy over victory in battle versus absolute despair, happiness at peace, calls for judgment, really any human emotion or event you can find expressed in some way, shape, or form in the Psalms. So really good stuff there. And is music. We don't know how it was originally sung, but it was supposed to be sung. So a couple I'd like to point out specifically that relate to what we're talking about. First is Psalm 137. If you know your Psalms, this is a bad one. This is the one that begins, "By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered you, O Zion. As for our harps, we hung them up on the trees in the midst of that land. For those who led us away captive asked us for a song, and our oppressors called for mirth. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song upon an alien soil?" And so the context of this psalm is the people have been hauled off to Babylon and are in exile and captivity. Their temple has been destroyed. Their entire way of life is destroyed. They're gone from their homeland. They are at rock bottom. I mean, a lot of their relatives and children have been killed in war. They're probably starving. They're not being treated very well. And yet they had this beautiful music, and all their captors in Babylon were like, "Hey, you have those great songs you used to sing back in Jerusalem. Will you sing some of them for us?" And that's the emotion of the psalm is, no, how could we possibly sing those happy songs we used to sing for your entertainment when we're stranded in this terrible land? Next, I'd like to turn the despair around to hope and move to Psalm 121.
Yeah. Okay.
Nancy's back. Hey, Nancy.
Sorry, my internet froze.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
So Psalm 121, we're on the third Psalm now. This takes the despair and turns it around to hope. It's another very famous Psalm. "I lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence is my help come." And so again, the psalmist is despairing, not knowing what to do. And in fact, someone, I can't remember who it was, someone who gave a talk at St. Mark's once talked about the geography of Jerusalem and how when you're in, I believe it's Jerusalem, not Bethlehem that he was talking about, you look up to the hills. It's completely surrounded by mountains. And so it'd be very easy to be surrounded by your enemies if you were there. And so that's really more what that means. I think of it as North Carolina. I go look at the view of the mountains. Oh, I lift up mine eyes to the hills. This very picturesque thing, but he's saying, no, it's much more despairing. You're surrounded by mountains. Your attackers are up on the mountains, ready to come down and get you. Where's your help going to come from? And then the very next verse, "My help cometh even from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." So again, the Psalms express that despair, but our Christian hope is that, God and through the saving act of Jesus Christ on the cross saves us from that despair. We have a way out. And so I could, any one of these topics that we're going to cover, we could talk for hours and hours and hours. I could keep going on the Psalms forever. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible, but I'm going to leave it at that as sort of our origins, and then move on to other topics. I can recommend before I go, though, one of my favorite books of all time is C.S. Lewis's Meditations on the Psalms. It's a very short read, and it's just his take on the Psalms and what they're all about, both for Jews and for Christians reading them in a Christian context, sort of backwards. C.S. Lewis is easy to read anyway. He's a very good writer, but this is very short and a fun read, and really can open your eyes to some themes in the Psalms that you would maybe see otherwise. So I can highly recommend that. So any questions on Psalms before we go on?
No.
All good? All right. So next I'd like to leapfrog up a good couple thousand years to the Reformation. Part of my way of narrowing this conversation down is just trying to keep it to sacred music, because obviously there's music of all kinds that expresses emotion. So I'm trying to talk about music of the church. And if you think about times of trial in the church, the Reformation obviously leaps to mind.
Yeah.
You know, it was an important time in our history, and a time of much strife amongst fellow Christians. So obviously, as you know, the Reformation was begun. The act that kind of started it was Martin Luther's nailing of the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517. But then it all snowballed from there, and people published treatises and argued back and forth, and for a long time. But the basic idea was that the Catholic Church had, in their eyes, reached a point of sort of corruption. It had lost its true intent. It had kind of wandered from what the Reformers thought Jesus and the Bible intended for us to be doing. And so they wanted to reform it. And the intent wasn't necessarily to break off at first. It was just to reform. But what ended up happening was a break off. Protestants broke off. Catholics kept going. And then over a couple hundred years period, there were many wars were fought between Catholics and Protestants over all of this. And so a very long period of upheaval in our church history. And then it was simultaneously countered with a counter-reformation, which was what the Catholics did. They took the ideas of the Reformers to heart and reformed themselves. And actually, William and I were talking earlier today about how things kind of come full circle. There's plenty of Catholic churches today that have "The Mighty Fortress Is Our God" in their hymnal, because they've continued that. A lot of people argue that the Catholic Counter-Reformation never really stopped until Vatican II in the 60s. They just kept reforming and reforming and reforming. And then you get to Vatican II in the 60s, and now they have all their services in English. They sing plenty of Protestant hymns. And so they've almost come full circle. We might as well be worshiping with them together again, because a lot of our things are the same. Not completely, but anyway, it's just interesting to think about all that. So one of the big ideas for the Reformers was for the common man and woman, just common everyday person, to be able to worship in a language that they understood. Everything the whole mass was performed in Latin. All the music was performed in Latin or Greek. And so most people had no idea what was going on. They just showed up and they were told what to do by the priests and told what to do when, and didn't really fully understand it. And they couldn't read the Bible in their own language either. So they translated the Bible in their own language. And then very early on, Martin Luther especially, music was very important to him in his daily life, but also in worship. He considered it second only to prayer. And he understood that it had such a power to teach. When you match words and music together, the power for you to be able to learn from that is twofold, because you have the words and the tune. And so he started translating old hymns into German, and other people did, French, English, whatever, for their own people. He composed some of his own tunes. He arranged old Gregorian chant tunes into just metered hymns that people could use. And many others did too. It wasn't just Martin Luther that did that. So there's this sort of explosion of hymn writing that came out of the Reformation that's very important. A lot of people's favorite hymns come from this period. And not just Martin Luther's time, but for the, maybe 200-year period around then. Just a lot of really important hymns and tunes were written in German, then translated into English, or in English, or in French, or whatever, and not just hymns, but also teaching hymns. Luther wrote. He made poems out of the Nicene Creed, out of the Lord's Prayer, out of all these important documents of the church. He put them in singable hymn form so children could learn them. And so there's actually a German chorale setting of the Creed and the Lord's Prayer, Vater unser in Himmelreich. I mean, it's really amazing what he did in a short amount of time. And so that is hugely important. And so I would characterize this particular time of trial as more the necessity is the mother of invention kind of. They were hit with this adversity. They needed music to do something for them, and they got it to do it. So it's less, in some times of trial, music is more of an emotional response. This is more like, hey, we love this church music. We want it to work for us. We want it to work better. And they made it happen. So it's more of sort of a necessity thing than an emotional thing.
So really what they did was they used it in order to get their thoughts across in order to get the
That's right.
gospel across in a
That's right.
Protestant manner, and use that more of teaching. I know I've heard a couple of the crowds that you're talking about. It's been a while, but there is that richness, and where it's singable and children can remember it, and
Right.
and so it goes to your heart. It's an
It
easy
does.
way.
It does. And the funny thing is, Martin Luther didn't come up with that idea. Nancy, in my little outline, I refer to the hymn wars, the early church hymn wars. That's my own funny name for them. But early on, the early church fathers, and here I'm talking about like in the 300s, like Ambrose of Milan, Aurelius Prudentius, they wrote hymns to communicate doctrine. Christianity in its early times, there was a lot of sort of heresies. The church was just growing. It was just being born. And so people came up with ideas, and you hear of heresies like Arianism and things like that. People who didn't believe in the Trinity, people who didn't believe that Jesus was fully God or fully man, things like that. They would write hymns to really bring those home. And again, same idea. If they have a tune that they can sing them with and they rhyme, sticks with people a lot better. And so a really famous example of that is Of the Father's Love Begotten, the famous Christmas carol. That was written, it's one of our earliest Christmas carols that we have, and it argues for the divine nature of Jesus and Trinity. And so it was one of those sort of hymns early on that was used to sort of teach church doctrine, very much in the same vein that Martin Luther did, 1,500 years later or 1,200 years later. Again, I'm going to move on because we could get bogged down in the Reformation for another couple hours easily. The way it affected the Counter-Reformation as far as music went. The Catholic Church already had a very, very rich music tradition. They had Gregorian chant, the whole Liber Usualis. By then, they had already developed the whole Renaissance idea of polyphony. Palestrina was writing that, all sorts of really, really good music. But the complaint for the music of the Catholic Church at the time was not just that it was not in English. There were many examples of music where they would sing in multiple languages at the same time. It's called a macaronic text. And composers would do it to kind of, it's very interesting and kind of a way to show off their composing abilities. But for the congregation, it meant they couldn't understand any of it. They also wrote in very, very complex polyphony meaning not just a hymn where everyone sings at the same time, but these very independent lines of music that weave together, again, making the words very hard to understand sometimes, and not just in 4 parts. Sometimes they would get to 6, 8, there's an example of a Thomas Tallis piece in English that gets to 40 parts. It's called Speminalium. And no one can understand it. So that was one of the reforms that they wanted in the Counter-Reformation was, we have this good music, but let's try to make it a little more user-friendly for the congregation. A thing that rings true today. I mean, every generation in the church has that idea of, hey, we really like this music, but it's getting kind of complex. Can you make it a little more useful, user-friendly for the congregation? We hear that even still today. And so they definitely did that. There's an apocryphal story of Palestrina, who's probably one of the most famous Renaissance Catholic composers. The story goes that he saved polyphony. At the Council of Trent, apparently, they wanted to throw polyphony out completely because no one could understand it. They wanted simple music. And so the legend goes, and it is a legend, it's probably not true, that he wrote his famous Pepe Mocelli Mass. Jerry, I'm sure you've sung it before. It's very famous, the Missa Pepe Mocelli, to show them that you could have polyphony that was also intelligible. And it is. It's much more sort of homophonic. The lines kind of fit together. And the idea is that he got a choir to come in and he sang it for the people at the Council of Trent. And they're like, oh, that's great. And they didn't get rid of polyphony. It's a really cool story, but it's probably not true. But the reforms are true. They did things like that to make music more user-friendly, more intelligible. People could get more out of it because they could understand what was being sung, and it highlighted the service rather than just sort of being this really complex and interesting concert going on in the background. So any Reformation or Counter-Reformation questions before we launch on to our next topic? Hey, Catherine's here.
Hey, Catherine.
Hey, Nancy.
How you doing?
Great.
So my next category that I'd like to talk about is music and pandemic. And as I said earlier when we first started, just go Google it. When you get off of this, go Google it. It is amazing. The pandemic has been a while, 3 months, but still not relatively short amount of time. How many articles and things have been written on it? and works referenced that were written earlier. Like this musicologist wrote a really interesting book fairly recently on music during the Black Plague. And now all these people who are writing these articles about music during pandemics are referencing this same guy's book. So there's a lot out there.
Music during the Black Plague. Other than
Yeah.
a funeral dirge, one wonders what else was there. Oh,
It's
my.
actually the opposite of what you'd expect. They had big parties.
Big parties.
Let me get to, let's see. All right, because there's a couple things I actually want to quote for this. So music during pandemic has a very long and varied history going back to ancient times. So I'm gonna read this as a quote. From as early as ancient Egypt, Greece, and the Babylonians, music was a reliable tool for spiritual healing, social bonding for thousands of years amid various diseases. For example, when a plague struck Sparta in 7th century BC, city leaders petitioned the poet Thaletus to sing hymns, and Terpander, another noted ancient Greek poet, was called up during a plague in Lesbos. Even Pythagoras, the great creator of every school child's favorite theorem, the Pythagorean theorem, used music as a therapeutic device, playing the lyre to calm drunken hooligans. So there's a long history of, music soothes the savage beast. So music has always had a role to play during the many, many plagues. We're lucky. This is the only pandemic that we've had in my lifetime, and probably most people's lifetime. They used to be way, way more commonplace. And so a person, before we jump up to the plague, I'd like to talk first about Saint Sebastian. He is the sort of patron saint of plagues. Lucky guy. Of all the things you could be the patron saint for, plagues. So like many early saints, he's the patron saint of many things. He's often depicted in art. You may see him with arrows. He's tied to a tree with arrows going through him. Don't remember the backstory on that, but he survived whatever that was. And then later, it wasn't something that happened during his lifetime as a saint, but after he died, I think it was in the 7th century, some church in Italy prayed to him during a plague, and their church members survived. And so that's how he became the patron saint of plagues.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on any of this. This is all very off the cuff. So, but he's now the patron saint of plagues. And so at various times, particularly in the Renaissance during plagues, composers would write anthems to or about Saint Sebastian, asking for relief from plague. And so it's hilarious. Let me see if I can find the correct quote. So the Franco-Flemish composer Guillaume Dufay in the, so that'll be 15th century, wrote a motet to Saint Sebastian, and one of the lines says, if you wish, I guess it would be Latin that he wrote this. In Latin, the translation is, if you wish, you can make this plague to stop. Can you imagine as a choir singing that as your line?
We need that now.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, we should, actually, I should get the choir to sing that on Sunday. That would be great. Maybe we could finally get this thing to be done with. But so there's this tradition of praying to or singing to Saint Sebastian, the patron saint of plagues. Then if you fast forward to the actual Black Plague, this was, I thought, a very thought-provoking, just make sure I'm, sorry, there's so many articles on this. Give me 1 second. I apologize.
No, go
I
right
have this
ahead.
highlighted, and I thought I printed this in color, but it's not in color, so I don't see my highlights.
Technology is great when it doesn't work. It's a bear.
Here it is. Here it is. Okay. So, again, this is quoting from an article. Disease is on the prowl. As residents hide behind locked doors, barely a footstep is heard on Milan's cobbled streets. A strict quarantine is in effect, and all commerce, trade, and public life have vanished. The area around Il Duomo, meaning their cathedral, the city's ornate cathedral, stands empty. Fearing contagion, all religious gatherings have been banned. But when it comes to their faith, and importantly their music, nothing can stand in people's way. Following a call to go to church in spirit, they launch a collective act of social and musical defiance. Windows are open, doors unlocked, and balconies perched on as thousands of men and women and children start to sing. Now, have you seen these videos?
Yes.
So do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes. Uh-huh.
because that's not what it is. So no, this is not Milan during this coronavirus lockdown. This is the summer of 1576, and this is not the Black Plague. It's the Plague of St. Charles, similar. It has devastated much of Italian's North Country. It was a sight to see, one commentator at the time said, when all the inhabitants of this populous city, numbering little short of 300,000 souls, sent up together a harmonious voice. So even though these viral videos have gone around and everyone's seen them of the people in Italy leaning out of their windows and singing, which is great, wasn't their idea. They've been doing this for hundreds of years during plagues. And I don't know who all here has been to Italy. One of my favorite towns in Italy that we went to on our honeymoon was Siena, which is much more medieval than Renaissance. And the streets are like that. I mean, they are so narrow. So it really is easy to imagine people leaning out of their windows. And I mean, you could probably reach out and touch some of your neighbors, singing, sometimes even in harmony. So it's really cool to think that not just in modern times on Zoom have people been doing this. It's been a common response to sing your way through pandemic, because it's a good music, as Jerry can attest to inquire. It's a great way to sort of be together with other humans. It's a great thing to do together. So that idea is not new. In the Black Plague specifically, that killed so many people. Depending on estimates, anywhere from a quarter to a half of Europe's population at the time died from Black Plague in the course of 2 or 3 years, depending on when you count when it started and ended. And so things kind of went out the window, property rights even. You know, people would just walk into other people's houses and just take the stuff because no one was there. And so things got a little weird for a couple of years. And one thing that people did was they started having massive parties. They just figured, hey, we're going to die. Let's just enjoy the last couple of weeks or months or whatever we have. And so all sorts of music. People would wander around the streets in big groups singing. They called them Black Plague parades. They would gather at people's houses and have these sort of bacchanalian, parties. And so it was an interesting time in history. And it was right at a time in the Renaissance when music was starting to get more complicated. Not necessarily church music, but they started singing more things that are called ballades and virelays, and they became very popular at the time. And then, of course, the plague ended, and some people survived, and this music was preserved afterwards. But it's very interesting. You think of Black Plague, and I would expect it to be almost like World War I, where the devastation was just so complete that the outpouring of poignant and sad poetry and music afterwards was just sort of overwhelming. And you would expect that from the Black Plague as well, and I'm sure there was some of that, but no, a lot of the music was sort of party music. So,
Party music, yeah.
very strange reaction to a time of trial.
Well, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. So yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then if you fast forward to the current day, we have both. We have
We're doing it.
Zoom choirs putting together all sorts of really fun things, really really touching and poignant remembrances of people who have died. I mean, it really runs the gamut. And so the response now has been very widespread because of technology. We can all share the same things, and anywhere from church music to Neil Diamond changed the lyrics of one of his songs.
Oh, I know. Truly.
That was pretty. Sweet Caroline,
Well,
I think was the.
I think it gives you hope. It uplifts the spirit. I mean, really, it is powerful. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Absolutely.
I don't want to interrupt you. So
No, not at all. Please, anybody interrupt anytime. So since we're on the Black Plague and pandemic, let's transition now to music and death, which is another time of trial for most people. That, of course, makes us think of the Requiem Mass. If we're trying to sort of stick to church music, the Requiem obviously is the Catholic Mass for the dead, from the Latin Requiem in Pace or whatever, rest in peace. And so the Mass gets its name for that. So it's like the regular Mass where there's communion, but it's specifically a Mass for the dead. So the parts of the Mass that you would normally sing on a Sunday morning change a little bit, and the wording changes a little bit to be more specific to someone being buried. So Requiem Masses have been written for hundreds of years. The chants that they're based on come from the Old Gregorian chant, Liber Usualis, so that's very old. And then starting very, very late medieval and then early Renaissance times, they started writing requiems. Probably the earliest, I believe, are 14th century. Dufay and who's the other one? Ockeghem, I think, wrote the first formal polyphonic requiem masses that we know of. But then very famous settings like ones by Thomas Luis de Victoria, the Spanish Renaissance composer, really, really beautiful settings, all the way up to modern times. and I'm going to kind of zip ahead because I don't want this to take too long. But when you get closer to modern times, you get into what we think of sort of non-liturgical, non-service requiem masses. And so the early ones were meant to be sung in a service, and not like maybe a average Joe's service. They were usually commissioned for a king or a prince or someone famous who died, because you had to have a professional choir to be able to sing them. But they were meant to be performed in church during a service. But then when you fast forward to more modern times during the Romantic era, Verdi, Fauré, some of those were not necessarily meant to be performed in church. The Verdi Requiem especially, it takes like 2 hours to perform. It's basically an opera using the text of the Requiem. So they sort of grow as an art form out of themselves. And then in modern times, like in the 20th century, particularly in response to World War I and II, you get these war requiem settings, and they help the requiem grow beyond even a religious context. There's many requiems that are sort of non-religious concert pieces. Some of them use little bits of the requiem mass, but some of them intersperse other poems, political messages, all sorts of things get mixed in, and they're just meant to honor the dead, whether it's in a religious way or not. They're still called requiems. And so there's a long tradition of these. And with that, Nancy, if you're following along on my little thing, I'm going to go ahead and transition into number 6, because they're related, music and war.
Right.
So because I wanted to talk about the Britain War Requiem, but that's going to transition into music and war. So that's kind of my transition piece there. So the Britain's War Requiem was written after World War II for, I believe it was the rebuilding of Coventry Cathedral, which had been bombed by the Nazis. But it's one of those that used both parts of the Mass and also secular poems. And it used poems by Wilfred Owen, who is one of the World War I war poets. So there was a group of poets that were very young guys that were killed during the war, who wrote very famous poems during the war that are now remembered because they were killed. And a lot of them were about the war. Some very, very famous poems. And so Wilfred Owen was one of those guys, and Britain used, it was kind of both. It was sacred and secular. It was meant to be sacred. It was performed in a cathedral for the rededication of the cathedral, but it also used these war poems to sort of comment on just the terrible disaster that World War I and II were, just the toll on human life and suffering. And so music and war, as a topic, again, vast, we could talk about it for hours. But so music and war can have both of the things we were talking about at the beginning. If you think about like a lot of the newsreels and stuff in World War I and II, some of that music that they used was really meant to rally the troops, go on over and join the boys, and, sort of band music and peppy stuff that got you really excited about going off to war, versus the stuff that was written afterwards that was just people trying to cope with and deal with what had happened, and the turmoil of all of it and the suffering of all of it, and just sort of this profound sense of loss. You have both of that during most wars, definitely, before and after. And so like early examples of sort of celebratory music, Handel has a lot of it. So when Handel got to England, he got in with the king and queen pretty early on and was commissioned to write a lot of really important stuff. And so one of his first big commissions was the Utrecht Te Deum and Jubilate, which were concert pieces, but they were meant to be performed in the church. They were written to celebrate the Peace of Utrecht, which was the treaty that ended, I believe it was the War of Spanish Succession, one of those, I think, Protestant Catholic things again. And it was just a big, you can imagine Handel. It sounded kind of like the Messiah, different peppy parts of that. It was just really meant to just be a celebratory piece, celebrating the end of the war and the bringing of peace. But it's pretty famous. His Royal Fireworks music, which is also a very, very well-known piece by him and wonderful piece. Same thing. It was, I believe, for the end of the War of Austrian Succession. A lot of people, I didn't even realize until I started researching this, that was written as, again, a celebratory piece to sort of end the war. Like, hey, we're done. Let's have a big party to celebrate the fact that we're done. So,
Yes.
not processing loss,
Yeah.
just being happy that England won. So. So those are sort of famous sort of classical music examples.
So we don't have any where they're bemoaning the fact that they lost. Do we have any music
That's a great question. I don't know, probably, but I don't know that. We do for World War I and II, definitely. Yeah, definitely. So we're almost out of time, so I'm going to transition to that now. So An interesting thing, side note, if you want an interesting read, Google, music during World War I and II. Again, vast topic, but it's really interesting to read about the troops and what they did for music at the time. Every branch of the service had its own bands and stuff, and a lot of them were meant to just entertain the troops who were on break from the front line, or sort of get them in better spirits. But I mean, I found pictures of this guy. They called them trench cellos. They would get old boxes and put strings across them, and guys in the trenches, in World War I and II, who knew how to play instruments, would just make them so that in their off time they could be entertaining each other and have something to do other than just sort of sit there and think about all the horror they were enduring. And my sister, another side note, used to work at the Holocaust Museum in DC, and they have a musicologist on staff who just studies music that was written and composed in concentration camps. So again, even in that's one of the worst times of trial you could think of, having to live through and possibly die in one of those Nazi concentration camps. They still found time and made effort to express themselves through music. Obviously, that music was more sort of sad and tragic. They weren't trying to raise each other's spirits necessarily, but some very profound things were written, including very famous piece, Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, was originally written while he was in a concentration camp. So it's really amazing stuff comes out of the two wars. But what I would like to turn to,
James, I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even you go back to the Psalms, weren't musicians used to often lead the troops into battle?
Yes.
Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Music has so many different purposes. Think about Scotland. Okay, so the bagpipe, that was one of the original uses of the bagpipe. It was a war instrument. Sort of stir the troops up and get them all old.
They're the people they were attacking.
Think about the Revolutionary War and the guys with the drums and the fifes, and the whole thing was, to set a beat for them to march to. You had quick marches, you had slow marches, you had retreats. Music was very important in times of war, and not just, again, to deal with emotion, but to sort of rally the troops and get them to do what you wanted them to do. Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. So the last thing I'd like to end with, and I'm sorry, I feel like I'm sort of skipping over, but there's just so much to talk about, is things that were written in response to World War I and II. Particularly, one sec, let me get to the end of my notes here. So I already mentioned the war poets from World War I. There were also some composers involved in World War I. Ralph Vaughan Williams served. Holst wanted to serve but got medical, he couldn't because of medical reasons. A relatively famous guy named Charles Butterworth served, who was a friend of theirs and got killed. So the war affected musicians just as much as poets, and some of them, wrote music to respond. One of Vaughan Williams' most famous, and if you know who Ralph Vaughan Williams is, so he's a very famous musician in British history, and famous to us as Episcopalians because he arranged tons of folk songs into hymns in our hymnal, and also composed some of his own. So For All the Saints, Sine Nomine, he wrote that one, really famous things. So he wrote a really well-known piece called Dona Nobis Pacem, which means give us peace. Again, a very eclectic mix of sacred texts, some political speeches, some poems written kind of between the two wars as tensions were building again with the Nazis for World War II, as his sort of plea, come on, guys, give us peace. We don't need to do this again. So I would encourage you to give a listen to that one. And then Gustav Holst, who I just mentioned. So he's well known as he wrote the Planets. And in fact, Nancy, I'm going to transition to I Vow to Thee, My Country. That was the hymn you asked me about. He wrote the tune for that. It comes from the Planets. It's the tune from Jupiter. He wrote one right after the war in 1919 called Ode to Death, just sort of his way of dealing with all his friends that he had lost. Including, sorry, not Charles, but George Butterworth, who had died. So that's another important piece. But what I'd like to end with is Charles Wood. Gosh, there's so many. All right, but I'm going to end with Charles Wood. So Charles Wood was an English composer who was sort of the generation before Vaughan Williams and Holst and all those guys. And so he actually started in the late 1800s. He died early 20s, 1926, something like that. But he wrote a piece in 1919, I think it was, called Expectans Expectavi. And Jerry knows this. We've sung it in choir before. So that is the title of a poem by Charles Hamilton Sorley, who was one of those war poets that I mentioned. And he's one of the, along with, well, it's debatable who's more famous, but he's one of the three. Rupert Graves and Wilfred Owen are the others. He wrote the one, the empty mouths of the thousands dead. But I can't remember the line. But that's a different poem. This one, I'm going to read the whole poem because it's amazing. So Expectans Expectavi is the Latin incipit of Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. And it's about waiting patiently for the Lord to come to you, even though he doesn't say that in the poem. And so once you hear a little bit of it, you'll probably realize that you've heard this before. So here's the entire poem by Sorley. From morn to midnight, all day through, I laugh and play as others do. I sin and chatter just the same as others with a different name. And all year long upon the stage, I dance and tumble and do rage so vehemently, I scarcely see the inner and eternal me. So in other words, he's a normal guy. He sins and he does whatever he wants. Mm-hmm. I have a temple I do not visit, a heart I have forgot, a self that I have never met, a secret shrine. So meaning his heart. And yet, this sanctuary of my soul, unwitting, I keep white and whole, unlatched and lit, if thou, with a capital T meaning God, if thou shouldst care to enter or to tarry there. With parted lips and outstretched hands and listening ears thy servant stands. Call thou early, call thou late, to thy great service dedicate. So the point of the poem is this guy, and Sorley died when he was 20. He was killed in World War I as a young man. So he wrote this in his probably late teens. Is that he felt this ambivalence. Like he's this normal guy that sort of goes about life sinning and just doing what he wants and doesn't think much about it. But really in him, he has this heart that is waiting for the Lord to enter at some point. This temple, this sanctuary that he keeps open and clean and ready for the Lord to enter when the Lord is ready to enter. And that's that last part. With parted lips and outstretched hands and listening ears, thy servant stands. Call thou early, call thou late. And that's where Charles Wood comes in. So Sorley died in 18 or 19. I can't remember which year he was killed. And then Wood wrote this in 1919. He only set the last two stanzas, starting with this sanctuary of my soul. So he composed music for those last two stanzas that speak specifically about the heart. And he gets to this point in the music that is so beautiful. The whole work is beautiful anyway, but he gets to this part where there's these dramatic 2 or 3 or 4 beat pauses. I can't remember how long they are, but they're rests written into the music. We're on call thou early, call thou late, because Sorley was killed early. He was called home. I mean, his heart was open early. And it was just this, it was the year after the war ended, this very poignant remembrance of all those guys who had died young, who had been called early. I love that. Every time you get to that, it's like you can hear a pin drop, especially if you're in a crowd of people who know the sort of story of how it was written. So a very fitting, small, I mean, this isn't like some big symphony that someone wrote. It's just a very small, short sort of chestnut of an anthem, but very poignant remembrance of all that devastation in World War I. And then it ends, to thy great service dedicate. So the remembrance of all that those young men and women did when they died in that war. So very, very, one of my favorite anthems of all time. Really, really cool piece of music. And let me transition. So Nancy had asked me about a hymn called I Vow to Thee, My Country, which it's considered now basically a British patriotic hymn. They learned it in school. It's basically talking about two homelands, kind of like the old hymn Jerusalem. It's talking about England, homeland, and being faithful to that, but also the eternal homeland and being faithful to that as well. It was written again during, like right before World War I by I think his name was Cecil Spring. I'm not sure I got that right. Who, interestingly enough, became the ambassador to the United States just before World War I broke out, or as it was breaking out. And he helped convince the U.S. to enter the war. He wrote the words for that, and he actually changed the original first stanza, which was much more sort of warlike and talked about marshaling guns and stuff like that. He changed it to be a little bit more peaceful sounding. And then Holst was asked right after the war, because it had gained pop. People loved it. It became one of those sort of rallying poems that people treasured during the war. They asked Holst to set it. He took the tune from The Planets, which is interesting. I didn't know that. A lot of people adapt a lot of Handel's operas and stuff. They take a little. Joy to the World, for example, it was written by Handel, but he didn't write it as Joy to the World. It came from some musical he wrote, and someone adapted it to Joy to the World. I always assumed that's what they had done with The Planets, but Holst himself did it. He took the tune out and made it fit the words, and then the text and tune are perfectly matched. It's really, if you know, is I vow to thee my country, da, da, da. So it's a very beautiful hymn. It's sung now on Remembrance Day, which is in November. It's basically our Armistice Day. It's the same day. They call it Poppy Day. Whatever they remember the people originally killed in World War I, but now it's extended to World War II and other wars as well. So it's their Remembrance Day, and it's one of their sort of rallying hymns. Princess Di loved it as a schoolgirl, so she had it at her wedding and her funeral and at her the 10th anniversary of her funeral. It was very important to her. So it's kind of one of those hymns that sort of gets you right in the heart. Really beautiful wartime hymn. So, and then the last thing I'm going to just skip. I was going to bring us up to music and protest, since we're in this time. I was going to brush over the Vietnam War. I mean, think about how much music was written during the Vietnam War as protest. So again, using music for protest is not a new thing by any stretch. It'll be interesting to see after things calm down or whatever, how musicians react and process what we're going through right now with all these protests. And there's certainly already rap songs and things like that mention things like this, and so it's already kind of happening. But it'd be interesting, in another 10 years to sort of look back and say, out of these protests, did we get any sort of important music that came from it? Who knows? We might.
It would be interesting to see what the new hymnody will be for this period of time.
Right.
Unfortunately, you will I won't probably live to see it, but you might very well. So it'll be interesting to see what comes forth,
right?
And even in symphonic pieces as well.
Yeah, no, a great example is famous old hymn, "In Christ there is no east and west, and in there no north and south." I don't quote me in this. I wouldn't swear to it, but I'm pretty sure that was written right after the Civil War. So
yeah, I've heard that too.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll get similar, very meaningful hymns that come out of what we're going through right now.
Yeah,
we'll see.
So,
that's all I have prepared. I know that took a while, but we have time for questions or comments or anything if folks want to.
Anyone have any questions or thoughts that they might have?
I just wonder if we'll see anything by Country Joe and the Fish in the new hymnal.
Who knows? You never know.
You might.
So James, just a general question about the choir. How, with us getting ready to come back into the church, are you going to be able to bring in any more choir members, or are you going to stick with your
for now, we're just going to stick with the quartet. We're encouraging and actually doing a lot of things to try to get the congregation not to sing along. So, for example, we're not printing the words. There won't be hymnals for them to. There's nothing in there. So, if you happen to know the hymn and have it memorized, you can maybe sing along. But the idea is, as I'm sure you've heard, singing can spread the germs faster than just regular talking, interacting with folks. So we're trying to discourage singing. And so for now, the choir is just going to be the same quartet that's been there. They'll be mic'd. So hopefully they'll fill the room and sort of sound like a more full choir rather than just a sort of distant quartet. But that's all we're planning for now. I don't know when we'll be able to bring back the full choir, because it's just they have to sit so close together. Praise band's a little different. We can bring back a little bit more of the praise band because they're the way they stand with their microphones, they're already kind of social distanced anyway. Especially the guitars, they have a neck, the guitar neck, so they have to stand so far from each other. So I wish I knew the answer to that. I can't wait for the full choir to come back, but yeah, for now it'll just be the quartet.
Okay.
At least we can have 4-part harmony. So
yes,
there you go.
And they do a beautiful job too. They really they do. So
it'll be interesting to go back, because for now tricks of the trade. I don't know if you guys realize, but I think everyone here knows we pre-record them, and so we're able to do a lot of sort of sound checks with the choir and make sure the microphones are set right. And Even in a couple instances, we've been able to restart when we've messed up. But starting this Sunday, it's going to be live, and so it'll be very different and kind of nice to go back to sort of, it is what it is. We're just doing it live, and but the quartet's going to have to adjust a little bit, I think. So.
Yes.
Especially because there'll be people in the room. I mean, we've had the luxury of, we just sort of record it. So as long as it sounds good in the recording, it's okay, regardless of what it sounds like in the room. So now we're really going to have to be careful about both. So.
Very good.
Yes. Any further questions or thoughts? Well, all right. Well, thank you, James, so much.
Absolutely.
Yay, bravo.
Hey,
Come
Yes.
talk to me anytime. Like I said, it's a lot to cover. So if there's any
Well-
period you want to talk more about, come find me.
Well,
With
I
your
know.
mask on.
Well, I know, but you better not toot it too much, or we're going to want something maybe in Christian formation on this, because it's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah.
And anyway, to really see and to bring it into the Christian context of because so many, especially during the Reformation and those periods of time, there were those reflections of misery. And you didn't even touch on the African spirituals, which of course.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, there's
Yeah.
so many things we could talk about. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's
I also
true.
meant to talk about lessons and carols, because there's that famous line from the bidding prayer,
Yeah.
as we rejoice with those on another shore and in a greater light. That prayer was written the year after World War II ended, or World War I ended, and that line was put in there because of that, because so many people had died. So yeah, I mean, there's connections everywhere. There's a lot you could talk about, and
Yes.
I'd like to. So come find me.
We will. Thank you again. And
All
thank
right.
you everyone for being a part of this. We are truly excited. Our final webinar, which will be next Monday, Denise Warner from St. Mark's Episcopal Day School. She is I'm not sure of her exact title, but she's pretty much the counselor there. And she's going to be talking about children, especially young children, during this time of pandemic and opening up, and what parents need to be mindful of. And also some signs of maybe some depression in children that might be, that parents might not pick up, that they need to pick up on. So with that, blessings and peace to everyone, and go in peace to love and serve the Lord. And thank you again, James. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming.
Thanks
Good to see
for
you
the
all.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.